In Canada, you have to be an equal opportunity offender politically because there's only 37 million of us. You can't pick a side. If you pick a side, then you're alienating a lot of people, but you actually do have to adhere to the dictates of the profession, which is to rock the apple cart and hold power to account.
Ron James is arguably one of Canada's best-known comedians. On this edition of Today in BC, we'll ask him where the funny comes from. We'll talk about life on the Canadian road and his new book, All Over the Map.
From the latest community news to informative, entertaining reads for travelers and the cannabis curious, just visit your local Black Press Media community newspaper website to sign up today.
I wouldn't be a very good maritimer if I didn't know you were born in Glace Bay, Cape Breton, the Bay By.
There you go.
And grew up in Halifax, Nova Scotia. I found it pretty interesting reading your bio that your dad was from Newfoundland and your mother was from Cape Breton because, you know, that's a pretty serious DNA cocktail, you know, for going through life, spending it wearing a big smile and working really hard at whatever you do.
Well, it's like I say, with a pedigree like that, was comedy even an option? I was little for a long time as a kid, short, red-haired, freckles, 45 pounds till I was 14 years old, and 27 of that was my head. And then I actually say in the show, you know, when the circus came to town, Mom had to hide me. But it absolutely was. And Dad was a great joke teller, you know, like men of his era were. But he could really commandeer a room, just like a seasoned comedian. Mom loved a good laugh and was a talker, right? Mom can do 2.5 hours on the color beige after just one cup of red rose tea, man. And then, of course, the nature of the day. I was raised with one television channel for the longest time. And so it was still an oral culture, lots of talking, storytelling. That's not to say that everybody around me was that way, though, or my neighbors and such. We were just unique in that respect. I was always cutting up in class. I just seemed to have an affinity for it. The comments on my report card were indicative of that. Ron would do much better if he'd just be quiet.
So you were the funny kid in class?
Yeah, sure I was. But it's been an exponential leap, as any professional comedian will tell you, from being funny in the kitchen and classroom to being funny on stage. And that's where the 43 years of hard work in the comedy trenches comes in.
Tell us about growing up in Halifax in the 1960s and 70s.
It was a great place to be raised. I had a wonderful neighborhood. We lived next door to my father's Aunt Hilda, and she lived to be 96, sole Newfoundlander. Dad was always pulling practical jokes on her. He worked for the phone company. He was moonlighting, breaking down old businesses and things, picking up a few extra bucks with his buddy's moving company. And he found a mannequin arm with the hand on it, and he dug it in Aunt Hilda's rhubarb patch. And he said, Ronnie, I'm going to call Aunt Hilda, get her to get some rhubarb for us. Dad put the arm in Aunt Hilda's rhubarb patch, and he dragged me and Heather, my sister, and my mother to the back window and watched Aunt Hilda. Aunt Hilda was like 83 at the time, and down goes the head, and we see her leap. She must have left the ground 4 feet when she saw that arm coming up. She used to hide under the bed when thunderstorms occurred. We also had eclectic neighbors, and there was the Nova Scotia way of doing things, which lacked a formality. Somebody would just come in on the night wind for a drink, right? And the door wouldn't even knock. You know, you just hear them, hey, are you home? It was another world and another day. I reflect on it now with fondness, and it's bittersweet because Dad's gone. Mom's 89. But my father was funny right up until the end. When we put him in palliative care, he only lasted 48 hours. He had this perfect storm of renal cell carcinoma and COPD. And this was a guy who was always active. You know, he was fishing in the spring and hunting in the wintertime. And we took him into palliative care. And it's an example of his funny. They hadn't administered morphine yet, and he'd had 1 hour of sleep in 5 weeks. I mean, it was just miserable watching him suffer. He was curled up in his side of the bed. I went around to his side of the bed, and this beautiful brunette young nurse had just administered a catheter. And he looks up at me and says, Ronnie, am I ever happy to see you? Points down at his crotch and said, look what this beautiful young nurse just picked up for me at Canadian Tire. The guy's got 24 hours left on the planet before he steps into the hereafter, and he's still swinging for the fences. Mm-hmm. He still knows the purpose of funny. So that's what I come from.
Ron, do you remember the first joke that you came up with yourself and the feeling that you got from delivering that joke to various people?
I can't remember anything specific. I just remember, stupid kid jokes when you're 10 years old. I remember my cousins getting me to tell the joke and their parents getting me to, shut up. Actually, one of the first impressions I did used to be an ad on TV. There were 3 chimpanzees, or 1 chimpanzee just going, red rose tea, red rose, red rose. And then I used to imitate the guy playing the guitar on his lap and Don Messer. So, stuff like that.
And then professionally?
One of the best jokes I got, and I still remember, we were flying on the now defunct Canadian Airlines. Me and another comedian were flying on it, coming back from a gig in Winnipeg, and they gave me a sandwich. And I looked at it and I said, look at this sandwich. It's a bun in a bag, hard as the hobs of hell. This thing came off the table at the Last Supper. And in the middle was a slice of ham so thin the pig never even felt it coming off his arse. And there's another one, too. Oh, my goodness, they smoke in Quebec like it's a cure for cancer. That's another one, because it's got all the C's in it.
After growing up in Halifax, Dartmouth, you emigrated north to Acadia University.
I did.
So you prepared yourself for a lifetime of writing jokes and skewering politicians by studying political science.
I did. That was my major my first year, and then I shifted over to history. My first year was a real learning curve because I'd never been away from home before. And then I suddenly had all these seasoned mentors on my floor who were several years older than me. I used to tease one guy. I went to Acadia in 1976. His student card said 1970. I always used to say to him, you were walking Point and Nam when I was still in grade 7. But we partied hard in those days. But mostly, it was conversations in the lounge with intelligent roommates. One of the greatest things was my education wasn't myopic. There were eclectic points of view on the floor from everybody, and you had to get along. You didn't like everybody. Some of them were tools. For the most part, the conversations in the lounge in the evening were, opinionated, articulate, but you had to hold your own. And everybody had, came to the game with a strong point of view. Then I had some buddies, of course, who, I wasn't on the floor with. And look, we partied, man. What can I say? I'm dancing around the whole issue, brother. But, I majored in binge drinking and minored in hot knives. It's like I say to people, I'm from a day where a hashtag was something you got from getting too close to the hashed knives. But it was at Acadia where I got the acting bug. And that's what was instrumental about Acadia. 2 things developed there. My confidence on stage, or the beginning of it, that whetted my appetite for more. Did a couple of plays, and they had Musicadians there, I played a gangster in one of those Kiss Me Kate things, and I did Charlie Brown and played him. And that was one side. That was the structural side of it, where I took an English class taught by this old great dame of the theater. And then the other side of it was just riffing, channeling a muse that was being born. It was born there. Of course, Saturday Night Live had galvanized the attention of anyone who had aspirations to be a comedian or to be in comedy. Once I graduated, that propelled me to Second City because I learned that all the Saturday Night Live people had come from there.
Okay, so you're off to Toronto. You're joining up with the Second City troupe.
Yeah.
Who were some of the members? Well,
I started in the touring company in the summer of 1981 after taking the classes at the iconic old fire hall on Lombard Street, 110 Lombard Street. And it was a great place. I wish they'd have never moved from there. I thought a spirit disappeared when it went elsewhere, but that could just be my era. But I started in the Tourco. There was a high attrition rate that winter. We traveled the highways and byways of Ontario, and some people would come in from the classes and last maybe 3 weeks. They couldn't get along in the van, or they weren't good improvisers. Ultimately, it boils down to how compatible can you be? After a while, we were seasoned veterans who'd been in country for a long time. And then in the summer of 82, a young man joined the company who just finished his grade 12 exams, never been away from home before, and that was Mike Myers. So we were already seasoned veterans when Mike got in. And then the fall of 82, I got promoted to main stage. And on main stage, I was in the company with John Hempel, who created Maniac Mansion and starred in that with Eugene Levy, wrote Wagons West, and directed a dozen main stage shows. Donnie Lake, who's on a series with Steve Carell now called Space Force, who we still keep in touch with. He was the best man at my wedding. Deb McGrath, who's married to Colin Mockery, was a tour de force on stage as a female improviser, one of the strongest women to ever grace the Second City stage. Bruce Peary and Kathy Lasky. That was our cast in those days.
When Today in BC returns, Ron James tells us about life on the road and some of the folks he's met and the stories he's gathered along the way.
Why spend hours searching dealerships, comparing makes and models? Find the best of BC's inventory in one place, todaysdrive.com. You'll have access to inventory across BC, where you can easily find a vehicle that fits your needs and gets you where you need to go in comfort. Get in the driver's seat. Don't miss out on the many options we have available for you. Powered by Black Press Media, todaysdrive.com connects you with exclusive new and used car deals.
Today in BC is a Black Press Media podcast. I'm Peter McCully. We're with comedian Ron James. Ron, who do you think is funny?
Billy Connolly, hands down. I've never seen anybody channel the life force quite like that tartan shaman from Glasgow. I saw his first HBO special when I was at a work in Los Angeles for almost a year and a half. It was an epiphany, and I remember watching him own that stage and move across it, and I thought, my, oh my, I have to learn how to do this, because he was singing the song of his fractured tribe that sounded like my Celtic tribe. I think Ryan Belville is really funny. He's a Canadian comedian who's on Working Moms. He doesn't tour the Soft Cedars, although someday I'm sure he will. He's really funny. Mike Wilmot is hilarious, another Canadian comedian. Derek Seguin. Your listeners may not know them because Canadian stand-up is paid lip service. Other than myself, who tours the Soft Cedars, there's nobody coming out here. But Just for Laughs seems to be the way that people see their comedians, and it's only been recently that they decided to put Canadians on a bill that they get federal funds to run.
Who's the funniest person you know that has nothing to do with comedy for a living?
Well, there's not one exclusively, and I'd be unfair to everybody if I did. Mm-hmm. But I signed a book for a buddy of mine from Acadia, Peter Bugden. He's pretty funny. He's a Newfoundlander from Corner Brook. And I signed it. I said, the funniest man I know is not getting paid for it. My buddy back home, Sean Murphy's really funny, really dry.
So I'm assuming when the pandemic hit, you put away all your hobbies like the lawn darts and the wood burning kit. See, I know your material, Ron.
Right. Oh, you have done your research.
No, I've followed you all the way along, my friend, and decided to write the current book, All Over the Map.
I had actually started at Penguin Random House. They commissioned it when I was smack dab in the middle of my series, and I didn't have the time. And then I took a stab at it, and I wasn't ready, and I parked it. Then I got halfway through it before the pandemic started. I kept a third of that. I threw the rest away. And then one day I found my groove, and I stayed with it right through to the end. And I'm really glad I did. I tend to micromanage my sentences rather than blast it away macro. People say just vomit it up and fix it later. And then someone said, yeah, but then you're working with vomit. So I was lucky because I was very diligent about keeping notes in the early days on the road before social media dominated our lives. And I kept moleskins, and I had 2 bankers boxes filled with moleskins from page to page. So I had a lot to refer to, so that helped me.
That's a question I always ask everyone who is involved in some sort of a process like that. You know, Valdi and a few other songwriters I've talked to, they always seem to have Post-it notes and little pieces of paper in their top pocket and a box somewhere full of notes and whatnot.
And then, of course, I always have leftovers from my specials that never made it to TV. I mean, I would say that there's about maybe 10%, 15 at the max in that book that people might recognize from my specials. Mm-hmm. And I put that in because I knew the mandate of the book, that people wanted to laugh. But the book also allowed me to explore the emotional trajectory in the narrative. For instance, Vern, the story about the 60s scoop Indigenous man who's stranded on the road in Alberta, who for some reason knows my name, asked me for a lift to Leduc. I was there at the gas pumps. He said, "It's Ronnie James, a rock and roll star from the radio." Rock and roll star from the radio. Wow, man, he was funny.
So your book, All Over the Map, tells some very interesting stories. Maybe we can pick a few out here. One about traveling the country in a van. I think you have to be very selective about who you're in the van with, right?
Well, that gets back to the Second City experience, right? We were battle-hardened road warriors, driving through blizzards a Yeti wouldn't wander, feeling our wheels lift on black ice roads. It was the crucible. I loved it, though, but I can't recount exactly the words I used to describe how important it was to fit in to all of us on the road. But it depended on how funny you could be and if you could tell a good story and entertain people. But it was a remarkable time, and it taught me hard and fast lessons about the necessity of compatibility, being fair, generous. And that's also one of the dictates of improv, is an innate generosity. It got very complicated once we all got promoted to main stage because everybody was on their own messianic mission to fame.
And as you mentioned, you moved to Los Angeles for a brief period of time in the 90s.
Oh, it wasn't so, it was 3 years, and it felt like a long time when I was at a work in paradise. Once again, that carnivore's arena of Los Angeles with its relentless competition really was the crucible that honed my mettle. And I came out of there with a conviction that it was important for me to shift the paradigm and take charge of my career on my own terms rather than wait for somebody else to validate me. Even though I got some interesting gigs, some guest spots, and I was spokesman for Texas Tourism, and I did lots of national commercials, but it was never satisfying for my intellect. And when I came back to Toronto from L.A., I wrote Up and Down in Shaky Town, One Man's Journey Through the California Dream, which premiered on the Comedy Network its first season as a 90-minute special. Once again, I had to start over when I got back in TO2. I got 3 great reviews for that, but I couldn't make a living doing one-man shows, renting theaters, so I pulled the best 10 minutes out of that and started Amateur Night again at the age of 38. What I wanted to do was connect the dots and make sense of the chaos everyone's walking through in the language of laughs, and make sense of the world on my own terms. And that's what's wonderful about stand-up. And that's the door that it opened for me. And as I say in the book, I say, look, everybody thinks that improv and stand-up are the same. They couldn't be more different. I mean, improv, I liken it to half a dozen Bolsheviks trying to pick the color of a tractor on a communist farm, where stand-up is an enlightened dictatorship. It's boded me well, and I found the place where I belong. And the longer you stay in this line of work, or the longer you follow your bliss, I should say, because it's just not a line of work, it's a calling. And the longer you stay, the more comfortable you become in your own skin.
You use the English language in a manner that no one else in stand-up in Canada, previously or currently, is doing.
Well, I love language. I love the way it tickles off the tongue and tickles the ear as well as the funny bone. That way an audience is getting a double bang for their buck. A current one I'm running right now is that Joseph R. Biden cauterized the oozing cyst on the American body politic, but not before. Wait a second, let me try it again. Hold it now. I'm not on stage. I can remember it word for word on stage. Hold it. Thankfully, Joseph R. Biden cauterized the oozing cyst on the American body politic, but not before a morally bankrupt Republican Party evacuated its rancid effluvia into the streets of Washington that metamorphosed into a flesh and blood mob of mouth-breathing, batshit crazy, conspiracy-addled zealots in MAGA hats and Duck Dynasty camouflage looking to put the coup in cuckoo.
Wherever you go, are Canadians the same? Do they have the same funny bone?
Alberta's pretty sensitive.
In what way?
They don't like you to tip the apple cart about the fossil fuel reality. I don't play Quebec, but I can always, find some affinity with Alberta by slamming Quebec. But Alberta and Quebec are more alike than they'll admit. Yeah, that's the only place I get mail from, because you've got that strong conservative disposition out there, and conservatism is all about towing the party line, perpetuating the status quo, and deference to the patriarch. And it's a comedian's job to rock the apple cart, not ride in it. But Alberta was very, very good to me in the days of Klein, and I say as much in my book. I mean, it was very instrumental in giving many Atlantic Canadians a second chance when they suffer such economic disparity in the late 90s. And I mean, I was touring Alberta extensively in the mid-2000s. I mean, every time a car blew up in Baghdad, there were 2 new trucks in every Albertan's driveway. It was a pretty heady time. I began to understand the place. But in those days, I mean, only 20 years ago, 15 years ago, you could still make fun of Ralph Klein and Jean Chrétien in the same show, and everybody would laugh at both. Because in Canada, you have to be an equal opportunity offender politically. Because there's only 37 million of us. You can't pick a side. If you pick a side, then you're alienating a lot of people. And I never want to lose the room, but you actually do have to adhere to the dictates of the profession, which is to rock the apple cart and hold power to account. And if it's an abuse of power, i.e. the UCP and Jason Kenney's crowd, who abandoned his people for an entire month in August at the height of COVID, he deserves to be held to account. Just like Justin deserves to be held to account. I hold them both equally to account in my shows. And I try not to pick on the Green Party too much, but they are easy to pick on. You know, Elizabeth May's retired now, back in the fields of Nevermore, milking the unicorn. It's what Billy Connolly used to say. What's the intention of the joke? And it's very important for a comedian to punch up, not punch down. You want to topple the potentate in his golden throne, not pick on the disenfranchised and the marginalized, like that hack comedian Mike Ward did in Quebec, and whose radius probably stops at St. Louis de Ha-Ha, but the Supreme Court voted 5-4 in his favor. He picked on this kid suffering a hydrocephalic disorder. He fought it for 10 years, which to me creates open season on the disenfranchised by every hack comic who feels entitled to say what they want just because they're in front of a microphone. Freedom of speech also comes with a responsibility, and I like to think that compassion and moving the world to the right side of history is crucial. Boy, did I just answer that.
In your book, All Over the Map, you talk about life on the road, and there's more than one story in there about folks who you've met while on the road.
Yes.
And they tell you a story, and they say, don't use it in your show, save it for the book, and bingo, there it is.
Yeah. It was made for the book because it had an emotional depth, and it didn't belong in the show. There's a different tone to the show than there is to the book. Naturally, I wanted the humor to act as an adhesive in the book to the emotional narrative. When you're talking about substance, once again, emotional substance, things that have a different rhythm than the funny. For instance, my stage show, the rules of that arena are laughs, and I like to have them every 15 to 30 seconds. I like people to leave that show with sore ribs and a headache from laughing so hard. So that's my standard. With the book, if it's the waitress at the Delta Hotel in Calgary who tells me how Alberta was the land of the second chance for she and all her younger siblings, that she flew out 1 or 2 at a time after her parents were killed in a car accident in the early 70s, then her story deserves respect. One doesn't want to take it for granted that somebody opened a window on their world and had the confidence to share it with me. It's the same as when I joined the Ojibwe guide and the Dene elder for the caribou hunt 3 hours north of Yellowknife in the middle of the Barren Lands. We were sitting behind this billion-year-old boulder that had been dropped when the glaciers retreated, glassing this primal landscape that looked like God's hand had just molded it to pass over it. And he told me of his life as a redeemed heroin addict, how he was a cinematographer in Vancouver and graduated and couldn't get hired, and so started driving cab in the East End. What was the phrase he said? A Jesuit broke me and a Jesuit saved me. Talk about coming full circle. I sat between these men of another world, and they never spoke for an hour and a half. And when he finally spoke, I remember thinking, okay, I guess he trusts me enough. And it was just incredible. I grew up reading Studs Terkel, this old socialist that had a show on NPR in Chicago. And he wrote American Dreams, Lost and Found, Working, and The Last Good War. And he went around with a tape recorder and just interviewed people about their lives, people who fly below the red carpet radar. That's what interests me. Celebrity culture is just fast food without any calories. It doesn't last. All you have to do is crack an old TV guide from 10 years ago to realize how ephemeral and fleeting it all is. Besides, celebrity in Canada is an oxymoron. It is. That's why Scientology never really took hold here, because L. Ron Hubbard used Hollywood celebrities to lure people into his cult. I mean, you got to really want a messiah bad if you're going to join because Tom Cruise is the top potentate. I mean, no one's going to join Scientology in Canada because Buddy from Murdoch Mysteries told him to. So we wiggled out of that one pretty good. It's a good bullet to dodge, actually.
How many times do you suppose you've been back and forth from the East Coast to the West Coast performing your shows?
I'm sneaking up on 14.
I'm assuming that folks come up to you when you're ordering a coffee in the local coffee shop and you're on the road and they say, Ron, I saw you in this place and I remember this. How does that feel?
It feels great. It feels like I've done my job. And it feels like I'm carrying the spirit of hospitality that my parents had in Halifax for any wind-worn traveler that crossed their threshold.
I'd like to thank Ron James for joining us on this edition of Today in BC. We would like to hear from you. Send us a voice message with your comments and suggestions to podcast@todayinbc, or visit our website, todayinbc.com, or our Facebook page, Today in BC. You'll also find this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Amazon, iTunes, and Google Podcasts.